Good morning, everyone. My name is Susan Stokes, and on behalf of Bright Line Watch and the Yale Program on Democracy, I'm happy to welcome you to our conference, How Do Democracies Fall Apart and Could It Happen Here? We're going to take a couple of minutes at the beginning in this first session to introduce the work of Bright Line Watch and describe findings from recent surveys on the performance of democracy in the United States. First, I'd like to thank a few people. Daniel Stid from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation is somewhere here, and Joe Goldman and Donata Secondo from the Democracy Fund there's Joe and Donata, and the Democracy Fund and Hewlett have very generously funded the work of Bright Line Watch, and we're very grateful for their support. A hearty thanks also to Ian Shapiro, who I don't think is here yet, but he is the director of the Macmillan Center at Yale and has been very supportive of the work, this conference and the work of Bright Line Watch and the Yale Program on Democracy. Thanks as well to our hardworking staff at Macmillan. Thanks to Daniel Juarez, who you know from emails, and now you can meet him in person, who's done just tireless work for this conference and for the Center on Democracy in general. Hira Jaffrey, who may or may not be here, who's also been extremely helpful, and our own postdoctoral scholar, Herman Fairherd, who I think is still helping out top, but has been very, very, terrifically helpful in doing the conference. Lots of visitors from near and far. I just wanted to, a quick call out to Elaine Kamark of the Brookings Institution. Great to see you here. Rachel Kleinfeld from the Carnegie Endowment is back there. Sarah Doskow from Cambridge University Press. Great. And Adriana Mendoza from the Scholars Strategy Network. Great, thank you. One sad note, I just wanted to mention that Al Stepan was scheduled to be part of this conference, and as you know, Al passed away last week. He was an incredibly influential student scholar of democracy, how it collapses and how it keeps itself from collapsing. And we're just enormously saddened by this news, but I think we sort of feel the presence of Al throughout the proceedings today. So how Bright Line Watch got started, almost exactly this time last year, I received an email, I think from Avinash Dixit, an economist from Princeton, with a letter that was being circulated among economists that was expressing concern about the battering that some basic democratic institutions related to the economy, like the Fed, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, were taking during the campaign, and also their concerns about misinformation about the economy that was being put forth. I very smugly said to myself, wow, this is great, but, good thing economists, but a little late, right? And I sent this letter on to a number of people, including my friend and colleague Gretchen Helmke at the University of Rochester, and Gretchen immediately wrote back and said, is there a political science letter like this? So I thought, oops, so much for my smugness. So we quickly wrote a letter with input from lots of folks. And within 36 hours, we had signatures from over 350 political scientists, including most past and then current president of the American Political Science Association, and including Margaret Levy, who is a past president and who is here with us today. So, neither our letter nor the Economist letter changed the course of history, and so a few weeks later, after the election, we decided that it would be important to keep the effort up, and so we founded a small organization called Bright Line Watch. We got together with colleagues John Carey and Brendan Nyhan at Dartmouth College. Mitch Sanders, who is here somewhere, Mitch is our survey methodologist, and our name draws from a concept developed by Barry Weingast at Stanford University. And he's written about the constitutional protections being a kind of bright line, the violation of which should be immediately recognizable, not just to elite actors, but to civil society in general. And we our work is in a general sense to sort of analyze those bright lines, where they are, if they exist, what happens when they seem to be violated, and whether they can be identified, indeed, in the current environment in the United States. We aspire to do this by bringing our background as students of democratic institutions and practices, not just in the United States, but internationally, to bear on the situation in the U.S. today. So in addition to this conference, we've carried out surveys of political scientists and one of the public to gauge their sense of what democracy is and how American democracy is performing. And John Carey is going to talk to us in a minute about our survey findings. We've also authored, commissioned, and encouraged academics to write brief essays for the public sphere, bringing a broader perspective to issues like redistricting, the integrity of elections, and impeachment. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to John.
Thanks, Sue, and thank you all for coming. This is a real thrill to have this group in the room. So I'm going to try to give you a very quick overview of some of the survey results that we've had, that we've organized, focusing on the most recent survey, which we just published yesterday. And some of you may have had a chance to take a look at this. I'm sure most of you have been too busy to do so. There's a report on the Brightline website, with much more details about these. And I'm going to try to point us to some of the highlights. I'll also note you're receiving a statement of 27 principles, democratic principles. We're violating every rule of how to give a presentation, which is never hand out a text-heavy document to people right before you start speaking. But we did that because the core of these Brightline surveys are batteries of questions that revolve around these 27 statements. And it would be even worse if I were to try to show all that text up on the screen here. So what we've done is we've handed that out so that, either during my presentation or later on, you can refer to it so you kind of get a sense for what are these dimensions of democracy that Brightline Watch is focusing on. Okay, so what have we tried to do? This project was born out of a concern that the trajectory of American democracy may be possibly in trouble, maybe headed for a downturn. We have tried to evaluate the quality of American democracy both on a wide gauge and a narrow gauge. In a wide gauge, we've asked people in each of our 3 surveys, which took place this year in February, in May, and then just last month, to evaluate the overall quality of American democracy. And in the second survey, which took place in May, we also asked our political science experts to look retrospectively, and we chose dates spanning the entire history of the Republic. And we asked people to rate democracy on a 100-point scale, the quality of American democracy. So what we see when we have that really wide gauge, at least among our experts, was a steady increase in the quality of American democracy, peaking in the sort of mid to late 20th century, plateauing there, and then in that last iteration between 2015 and 2017, which were the last 2 dates, we saw a precipitous drop-off, the first substantial drop-off over time. So this, to some degree, validated our concern that we needed to pay closer attention. The narrow gauge that we've engaged with, these 27 statements, tries to disaggregate democracy across a number of dimensions. And unfortunately, we only started this exercise in February. So if we think about the more, the shorter time period, but the much more finely textured evaluation that we have, what we have here are the question about the quality of American democracy asks our respondents, on each of these dimensions, how's the U.S. doing? Is it fully meeting these standards, mostly meeting these standards, partly meeting them, or not meeting them at all? And so what you see here is the percentage of our experts that said we're fully meeting the standard or mostly meeting it. And you've got responses from February, May, and September. There's a whole lot of information up there, but the bottom line is that at least over these first 9 months of the Trump administration, our experts do not see systematic degradation. They see wide variation in how we're performing across these dimensions. But they don't see, since February anyways, a lot of degradation. And we're going to continue to do this every 3 months. And so, what we wish is that we had started this project 10 years ago, and we would then have a much more fine-grained timeline, but we didn't. This will go forward with. Now, the heart of the Bright Line Watch survey are 2 batteries of questions around these 27 statements. The first one actually asks, how important is this principle to democracy? So we'll take a look at what we see there. On this graph, now again, the respondents are presented with 4 options. For each of the principles, they can either say, it's absolutely essential to democracy. If you don't meet this standard, you're not a democracy. They can say it's very important to democracy. They can say it's beneficial, nice to have, but not critical. Or they can say it's not relevant at all. So what this graph shows is the percentage of respondents who said it's either essential or very important to democracy. The green dots are our political science experts, many of you in this room. The red dots are citizens, US citizens that approve of Donald Trump. And the blue dots are US citizens who disapprove of Donald Trump. So our motive here was to try to figure out, first of all, do our experts view democracy anything like the general public? Because one of the central criticisms of Bright Line Watch from the get-go has been, yeah, well, it's very nice that you're asking a lot of political scientists what they think about democracy, but we all know what political scientists, they're a bunch of pointy-headed, effete, ivory tower. You can add your adjectives, but their opinions have nothing to do with those of the general public. One of the things we see is actually our opinions do have something to do with those of the general public. The patterns are not dramatically different here. And the other thing about this graph that I think is important is that the patterns across Trump approvers and Trump disapprovers, Trump opponents, are not dramatically different. They differ on some critical items. They differ on the importance that they have assigned to equality of legal and political rights, equality of voting rights, and some other essential elements of electoral fairness, like whether districts should be biased, whether foreign influence on elections is a critical violation of democracy. But on the whole, what we take away from this graph is that democratic values are not all that different across these groups. The second main battery in the Bright Line Watch surveys are, on the same 27 statements, how do you think we're doing? How do you rate current democratic performance in the United States? And here we see much more polarization across groups, especially between Trump supporters and Trump opponents. But we also see that when we ask our experts, on more items than not, the experts actually rate American democracy as performing better than the general public, and in many cases better than both approvers and disapprovers of Donald Trump. This is kind of surprising to us. It's not true for every item, and of course you can see these items are ranked according to the performance evaluation of the experts. So at the top of the scale, the experts are substantially more sanguine about the performance of US democracy than the public. And at the bottom of the scale, they swing. Expert opinion tends to be more polarized than public opinion on this. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to move very quickly. All of these graphs are available in our report. And I also want to emphasize, especially, well, to everybody in the room, all of our data are available on the website already. We have not even had time yet to do 1/10 of the analysis that we look forward to doing on these, but one of the things we're committed to at Bright Line Watch is making everything publicly available immediately. And so if you want to download these and play with them yourselves, we encourage you to do so. The last 2 slides I'll show you are moving to, again, taking a step back from that disaggregated 27 dimensions of democracy to 2 questions that we asked in this most recent survey, both of the experts and of the general public. One of them is, how important is it to you to live in a democracy? And again, what we've done here is just superimpose the expert opinion in green over the public opinion in purple. The experts are slightly more committed to the idea of democratic government, but both groups remain overwhelmingly committed to the principle of living in a democracy. And finally, this also kind of makes even more stark the difference between expert and public opinion on performance. Here we have the experts in green. This was rating the quality of U.S. democracy on a 100-point scale. We've binned the responses into deciles. And what you see is that the experts on the whole, I think was the median response 82 out of 100, I think? 72, sorry. 72 out of 100. You know, so we get about a C- according to the experts. Well, actually, at Dartmouth, I guess that would be an A-. That's a different conference. But the public is substantially lower. And I think the public is around a 59. Again, I'm looking for support over here because I can't remember the number. But whether we look at the narrow gauge or whether we look at the broad gauge, the experts appear to be a bit more optimistic. And we speculate a little bit about this. We think part of this may be because so many of our experts have broader comparative experience. And one of the things we did with this conference was try to bring comparative scholarly experience into the room. Many of us have spent a good deal of our lives studying places where democracy has eroded, sometimes dramatically. And I think the experts may, with that broader comparative perspective, still see U.S. democracy more optimistically than the public does. So I'll finish up just by saying, you know, we founded this project, as Sue mentioned, to try to figure out, are there bright lines in American democracy? If so, what are they? Our 27 statements are our first effort to try to zero in on some places that we think bright lines could potentially exist, but we want to try to use our surveys and our other efforts to try to figure out how would we know when or whether we're crossing lines that threaten democracy, and how would we know when we might be approaching a transgression of those lines that would prompt a response in defense of democracy. We've drafted our surveys trying to focus attention on that. The responses are new. We're processing the information ourselves. We really are still in the process of doing that. We're formulating our reactions, but part of what we're asking you to do at this conference is to help us with that process. And so I really look forward to hearing everybody else's comments over the course of the day. Thank you.
Sorry, slight technical difficulty. Think about what jokes you want to tell yourselves when you get depressed by the end of the day. So I'll get started and we'll have slides that'll catch up soon. So my name's Joe Goldman. I'm the president of the Democracy Fund, which is a bipartisan foundation in Washington, D.C., created by the founder of eBay. We, along with our colleagues at the Madison Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation, are really happy to be able to support this important work today. So I wanted to say a couple words about slides that have not shown up yet. I wanted to say a couple words about why it was important for us to support this work, and then wanted to talk a little bit about a parallel piece of research that we have supported that we hope will be complementary to this work. There we go. So just again, so the foundation that I run, we've been around for a few years now. We have programs supporting kind of bipartisan efforts to make elections work better. We have a program that works with Congress to see, in this polarized time, what are things that can be done to make Congress work a little bit better. We do a lot of work with journalism and finding ways to make sure the American public gets the information that they need to be better informed and engaged in society. Coming out of this election, we found ourselves feeling that like there were really two important things that we really needed to do that were different than what we had done before. The first was to really get focused on what are the things that the nonprofit and reform community can do to ensure that the basic institutions of checks and balances within our system are functioning as well as possible. And so for us, that has meant making major investments in journalism, whether that is directly supporting nonprofit newsrooms. We made a $10 million commitment to a series of nonprofit newsrooms. We have supported litigation and advocacy support for journalists. It means trying to bolster checks and balances within the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the courts, whether that means protecting whistleblowers, whether it means helping staff in Congress who don't have a lot of experience performing oversight, figuring out how to play that role. And it means actually going to court when necessary to defend important rights that might be infringed upon. And this work has meant kind of standing up for those communities that may be threatened in these times, especially the American Muslim community. But it's also been really important for us to both draw a bright line on what is abnormal in these times, but also to try to really understand more about why we find ourselves in this position and what's going on. And to that end, we created this thing called the Voter Study Group. And the idea behind the Voter Study Group was to bring together a group of analysts and scholars from across the political spectrum. And that means on the left, we have folks from the Center for American Progress, from Brookings, from New America. On the right, it means we have folks from Heritage Action, from Cato, from AEI. In the middle, Pew Research Center, Latino Decisions, many others. And the notion is get this group of folks in a room to agree, not to agree on everything about what's going on, but to agree that we're going to study what's going on together and be in conversation together. And part of the reason we want to do this is to inform each other and kind of get ourselves out of each other's bubbles. But also, when we put out analyses of what's going on, we want to make sure wherever you sit on the political spectrum, you can see someone from this group who has credibility with you, right? Because part of what we're concerned with is kind of political and policy elites creating interpretations about what's going on that are not kind of grounded in data and accurate, and we want to try to fix that, right? So we actually ran a first survey back in December. Two things that were really interesting about the survey, right? One is we had a very large N, right? So we interviewed 8,000 people, which means we have a lot of statistical power. And the second thing is this was a longitudinal study. So we re-interviewed people who had been interviewed in 2011 and 12, in 2016 during the primaries, then after the general. So we actually have data about how opinions have changed over time, not just kind of projections about how opinions have changed over time. So we put out a first set of reports in the spring from this data. There were a couple kind of interesting things were jumping out, right? One, because of the unique nature of the data we had, we could actually look at how people's votes had changed, who were the kind of party switchers, right? And on one level, what you see up here is that people remained pretty consistent in their party voting, right? People who voted for Mitt Romney tended to vote for Donald Trump. People who voted for Barack Obama tended to vote for Hillary Clinton. But it wasn't totally the case. And in fact, more Barack Obama voters supported Donald Trump than Mitt Romney voters supporting Hillary Clinton. And digging into kind of who these party switchers are is super interesting. And kind of all the data on this is up on the web at Voter Study Group. I highly recommend taking a look at it. This graph is from a report by John Sides. What we were also able to do was kind of dig into the party coalitions. And Emily Ekins at Cato wrote a report where she essentially created a typology of Trump voters. And kind of this is the 5 categories that she created. And noted kind of this is kind of how she defined these folks. And these party switchers these folks who voted for Barack Obama and then ended up voting for Donald Trump, kind of fall in this American preservationist category, right? Folks at lower education levels, lower economic prospects, deeply kind of anti-establishment, and kind of super interesting to understand, right? So we put a second study into the field this summer where we interviewed 5,000 folks from the same longitudinal panel. And this time we included a battery of questions about kind of support for democracy. And I think this data ends up being pretty complementary to a lot of the kinds of things that we're learning from Bright Lines, right? So we asked 4 kinds of questions, about 12 questions in all within this battery of a larger survey. A set of questions about kind of what are your attitudes about different kinds of political system, whether it's a democracy, army rule, a strong leader who doesn't have to deal with checks and balances. We asked about kind of satisfaction with democracy and what you think about how this political system is working in the US. And then we asked a series of questions about kind of how you think about checks and balances as well as kind of toleration towards others. And one thing I would just point out is I think often we start focusing on questions about satisfaction with Washington, with democracy, in a way that doesn't distinguish between how we feel about democracy versus an alternative, right? And we think the more important and interesting question is how many folks are actually supportive or considering an alternative to a democracy, not just am I dissatisfied? And when we get into the data, we actually find these are very different groups of people. Those who are dissatisfied with what's going on here, that covers a wide range of different perspectives. That's very different than those who are open to a strong leader who doesn't have to deal with checks and balances or army rule. So here's just a quick kind of high-level data on this question of strong leader, army rule, and then a democracy. Now, good news, right? A lot of people think democracy is a good thing. But we do see, 18% think it's either a fairly good or very good idea to have army rule. 24% say that about a strong leader. And if anything, these numbers are low because the nature of our sample means we have a lower percentage of non-voters. And when we look at the data, we see that non-voters have a much higher likelihood of supporting these kind of alternatives. But this kind of surface, so there are a couple ways you can go with this data, right? One is to try to understand, is this changing? And some of the folks who will be speaking today have really looked at this quite a bit. The other direction you can go is to try to understand, who are these people? And I think that the nature of our data set allows us to try to look into these questions. And I've been working with Larry Diamond at Stanford and Lee Drutman at New America to get in at these questions. We'll have a paper out next month digging into this, but wanted to share a couple data points, right? So one is, yes, we see some differences between Clinton and Trump voters. That's not surprising. This was a question about kind of how you think about oversight over the executive branch. Not surprising that Trump voters might specifically be more supportive of a stronger executive when their guy is in office. But we can also dig into primary support, right? Because we have longitudinal data, we can see how do Kasich voters differ from Trump voters. And we actually see a pretty big distinction between a Kasich voter and a Trump voter here, right? And then if we go back to that earlier framework from Emily Ekins, when we think about the different groupings within the Trump electorate, we actually see some pretty significant distinctions, right? The American preservationist group, turns out they're actually much more open to alternatives to democracy than some of the others, the free marketeers and the staunch conservatives. So important to kind of understand and think about, right? And then we go kind of deeper and we looked for what are other characteristics of these folks who are open to democratic alternatives. Education ends up being an important perspective. News consumption ends up being an important perspective. Satisfaction with democracy, a sense of community disorder ends up being important. Anti-elite attitudes, whether or not you are a voter or not. These are all things that end up being interestingly correlated with support for democratic alternatives. And what we're really trying to dig into and understand is kind of to try to pull these things apart. One of the things we find, right, is there's a limit to how far you can actually go with quantitative data. You can only find so much out from a survey. And I think one of the things we think is important is to be able to pair this work with qualitative research to really dig into who these folks are and what is driving their attitudes. So just to close with a couple quick points, right? So one is, just to reiterate, we think it's really important to try to disaggregate and figure out what is the difference between those who are dissatisfied with our democracy versus those that are open to alternatives. Second, for those of us who want to then do something about it, it becomes really interesting to think about the difference between those who are at the extremes, right? Those who think army rule or a strong leader is a very good idea versus those who are kind of, maybe, right? Because kind of as folks wanting to do something about it, you need to figure out which of those camps is the more concerning and which you really want to focus on. And I think it's a really important question. Again, we think qualitative data is going to be really important to dig into this stuff. And then finally, so as someone who works with a lot of folks who work on press freedom, who work on government oversight, being able to kind of disaggregate this kind of data and understand who are the subpopulations that within a broader electorate that are open to these things becomes really important and useful to kind of the reformers and other actors who are trying to work on these things, because as you're trying to work on messaging, as you're trying to work on campaigns to influence folks on these things, being able to figure out who you need to sub-target becomes really, really important and interesting. So there's a lot more data, and we'll have a lot more to say about a month from now. This was just kind of a quick preview of some of the things that Larry, Lee, and I have been digging into from the voter study group data. All of the raw data from the original survey is up online at voterstudygroup.org. But anyway, really glad to be here. Hope I'm not too depressed by the end of the day, and look forward to digging into the conversation.
We are woefully behind already, but we're going to just take a couple of questions and then switch without anybody moving from their seats to the next panel. So just maybe two questions. Yes, Victoria.
I'm just wondering, there's a tremendous amount of literature on voter participation and voter attitudes coming from the 50s and 60s and 70s that showed a very significant sort of lack of support for some core fundamental values. Are you looking at some of this stuff retrospectively as well to sort of see whether we're getting worse or better?
We have not started to do that yet, but yeah, I think that's a good item to add to our agenda.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd say, and my academic colleagues can speak better to this than I, but how you word a given question on these things ends up being really, really important. And I think one of the challenges certainly that we've run up against is kind of consistency of the questions that are being asked, and so how to compare across time. But super important.
Go ahead.
Sure. So when I look at the list of those bright lines, it seems that there's an emphasis in your research agenda on institutions and formal requirements of democracy. But many political scientists work on civic culture and just the behavior of citizens. So is this something that you're trying to think of to include in your research agenda as well, or it's deliberately also maybe to compare with other countries who focus on institutions?
Does anyone else want to? I'll address it. Yeah, you're right. Actually, if you look at the list of 27, most of them do focus on institutions, governing elections, checks and balances, formal accountability procedures. There are, but you're also right that if I think about the discussion and the preoccupation about Trump in particular, both during the campaign and the presidency, so much of the discussion has been about norms of civility, discourse, and so forth. We do have 3 items, maybe 4, that where we do our best to try to focus on that. And if you see, they're at the bottom of the list, not because we regard them as the least important, but that was a idiosyncrasy of the list. And a couple of items to note about that. If you remember, the sort of importance and performance batteries that we asked about. On both importance and performance, those items rank low in people's estimation. And we were a little surprised by that. I was a little surprised by that, actually. And I think that's an area where I wonder. We're kind of working through what does that mean in the survey. I think there's pretty widespread acknowledgement, both in the public and by our experts, that those are the areas where our expectations about American democracy have been degraded the most in the last couple of years, maybe even further. But it's also, to me, surprising that people have rated those as among the least important items. So we're not ignoring that area, but we didn't, it was easier for us, maybe this reflects a bias of our own, it was easier for us to sort of tick off a number of institutional characteristics of democracy than it was to come up with normative ones. And this is an area where we would invite feedback and thoughts about it. Are there other principles, are there other statements that we should be including that reflect norms of civility, discourse, and behavior that we're not including?
Great, thank you very much for the panel.